Good morning, third hour. If you haven't realized, you have a sub today, but we're going to keep today as normal as possible. So what you need for class today is your notes and something to write with, which you hopefully already have out. Our notes are just continuing on from Monday. Remember Monday, we talked about the different series of laws passed by Great Britain, ranging from the Sugar and the Tea Act all the way to the Townshend Act. We also talked about key movements by the colonies in regards to the Sons of Liberty, but also for the Stamped Act Congress, which really eventually allowed them to get the Stamped Act kind of thrown out. So today's topic, I'm just going to call it more colonial unrest. Not only are we going to see a continuing series of taxation and other laws passed by Great Britain, but we're also going to start to see the colonies really ramp up their disagreement with Great Britain, which will result in violence breaking out. So probably the most important thing is after the end of each slide, I'll kind of take a second to allow you to finish copying the slides. But at any point you need the video to stop, just ask the sub, they'll press pause, and then once you're ready to go, they'll just continue resuming. So it's important to highlight that the center of all colonial life and culture and the center of their economics, not only the 13 colonies, but also for Great Britain, is all kind of centered around Boston. Boston's a very populated area, with roughly 16,000 colonists living in Boston alone at the start of 1770. We have important leaders like Sam Adams. With the help of John Hancock, are going to be some of the leaders in regards to the Sons of Liberty, which starts inside Boston that we talked about on Monday and Tuesday. And since this is the center of the colonial life and the economic hub for Great Britain due to Boston being that very viable port city, they're really worried that the colonists are going to cause more trouble. So if you remember, after the French and Indian War, Great Britain decided that they're going to keep the redcoats over in North America as a standing army to protect them. But at the start of about 1770, they're going to send roughly 4,000 more redcoats to the 13 colonies, with most of them going to Boston. I believe, if my documents are correct, that redcoats are going to be numbered at up to 2,000 inside of Boston alone. So they're not going to get along very well. The redcoats are not being paid very well, and they're having a hard time trying to make ends meet, especially in regards to the resources involved in the area. We have to remember that the 13 colonies are boycotting and protesting and not allowing much of the British goods to enter into the area. So the redcoats, some of them are actually forced to try to seek jobs within Boston to help make money to make those ends meet. But even though they are struggling, they will allow Great Britain to send their ships and to supply their military forces. But at the end of the day, Bostonians don't want the redcoats around. They don't like what they stand for. And remember, the relationship between the sides has become torn and is leading to an eventual breakup. So I'll give you a second to copy this slide down. So one of the big things that happens actually takes place in March 5th of 1770. Maybe one thing that we should be aware of is some of the events that are happening before, right? So we talked about the protests, and we talked about the boycotts. But inside of Boston, you really had to pick a side. Were you going to be a patriot, one that wants to fight for the independence of the 13 colonies, or do you want to be a loyalist, an individual that's going to stay loyal to Great Britain? So what the case is, a lot of patriots were giving loyalists a very hard time within Boston because they continue to sell British goods. So one time, a group of patriots started to harass a loyalist who was selling British goods. They were throwing stones and rocks at his business, and then eventually a British custom officer decides that he wants to break up this little protest. What he decides to do is pull out guns and fires, and he ends up shooting and killing an 11-year-old boy. So the tensions are already boiling. and we can see trouble on the horizon. So with tension still high, on March 5th, 1770, on a snowy night, some of the colonists in the area were giving a soldier a very difficult time just because they don't like one another. And basic stuff that you guys do today, you call each other's names and you throw stuff at people and then you go and tell. So there's a lot of back and forth in regards to name calling. And eventually the single soldier ends up hitting a colonist with his bayonet at the end of his rifle. And then kind of the bells started to ring and a lot more patriots start to flock into the area. And eventually they knocked this single soldier down to the ground. And the soldier calls for backup. Here comes reinforcements led by the British captain Thomas Preston. And his job was to make sure he settles down this mob. But again, the name calling continues. And then eventually, according to the Redcoats, the colonists start to throw snowballs at the Redcoats. And now, according to the colonists, after being hit by one of the snowballs, a Redcoat shoots and fires into the crowd. And then again, according to the colonists, they think they heard the word fire be said by a British soldier, and then multiple volleys were fired. This event is known as the Boston Massacre. It ends up only killing a total of 5 people, wounds about 6. And a very important person that was on your pretest was a guy named Crispus Attucks, who was located right here in the center, who was an individual of mixed race, was the first to perish during this Boston Massacre. So now you have even more chaos happening within Boston. But now, since there was a murder that took place on King Street, right outside the customs house, which is where the Redcoats were protecting the king's money that he gained from the taxation, we are going to put these Redcoats on trial. So what happens is Captain Thomas Preston and a few of the soldiers are going to be put on trial. They are going to be defended by a famous American, eventually second president, John Adams. Now, John Adams wasn't a loyalist. He could care less about the British. But him and the people around him realized that it was extremely important to give these individuals a fair trial. Because if they didn't, they believed that Great Britain would do something to get even. So John Adams is going to defend the soldiers and Captain Thomas Preston. He decides that the jury cannot be made up of Bostonians, so he wants the jury to be filled with outsiders. And being a lawyer, he's going to defend the Redcoats, even though he doesn't agree with Great Britain. It is a very important trial because the death penalty is at stake. But luckily for John Adams and the witnesses and the evidence, he was able to get the majority of the Redcoats to be found not guilty. But there will be 2 soldiers who are going to be charged with manslaughter inside of the whole idea of the Boston Massacre. So now the Boston Massacre is over, and we still have a lot of tension happening between Great Britain and the colonists. So later that month of March of 1770, Parliament starts to reconsider the Townshend Act, right? That placed a tax on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. But they decided that they wanted to keep the tax on tea. And the reason why is because tea is a major moneymaker for Great Britain. It is supposedly 1.2 million pounds of tea is consumed by the colonists in just 1 year. So going back to the root of all these issues, the whole claim of no taxation without representation. So we continue to boycott the tea that is being sent over by Great Britain. We are also going to continue smuggling in goods, something we talked about on Monday and what we looked at on Tuesday when we went through the photo analysts of the Sons of Liberty. So they're going to not purchase tea sent over from Great Britain, but they're going to focus on buying tea from the Dutch Tea Company. But on top of the Sons of Liberty, we have another group known as the Daughters of Liberty. And these individuals really go behind the scenes and are not really talked much throughout history. So the Daughters of Liberty, which kind of had the idea from Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams, was that they were going to help in regards to the protest and boycott of British goods. And since the women usually spent most of their time taking care of the household and raising the children, having tea time was a very common thing to take place. So they decided that they were going to pledge to not to drink tea, especially tea sent over from Great Britain. But since we were going through a boycott and we're not buying any British goods, the Daughters of Liberty found that it would be very important if they kind of help in the effort of producing hand-spun fabric. Then could be turned into clothing that could be sold within the colonies. So it's not just the men who get the rise of fame, but the Sons of Liberty. You also have the Daughters of Liberty doing a lot of the heavy lifting in the background. Fast forward to 1773. In May of 1773, Great Britain decides to pass what is known as the Tea Act. And it's somewhat different from the tax that was left behind in regards to the Townshend Act. So the big thing was a company known as the British East India Tea Company. Not really associated with Great Britain, but they had a great business relationship and allowed for both of them to be successful. But now the East Indian Tea Company was having a hard time making ends meet. So what the Tea Act does is it really allows the East India Tea Company to hold a monopoly over the tea being sold within the 13 colonies. This tea does not require to go through Great Britain to receive a tax. In fact, it's actually going to be sold cheaper inside the 13 colonies. But what this does is it kind of takes the business away from the merchants, the business people. So they don't want the East India Tea Company to hold this monopoly and cut them out from a living. So thanks to the help of the Sons of Liberty, we decided to get back. So December 15th, 1773, 3 ships arrived in the Boston Harbor, all filled with tea from the East Indian Tea Company. The governor of Massachusetts wants them to be able to dock and unload the ship. But the colonists are not going to allow that to happen. So as the ships were docked on December 16th to 1773, we're going to see roughly 100 colonists. Now the numbers vary from 100 to 200, but again, the Sons of Liberty were seen as that secret society, so not a lot of paper trail was left behind. So for this situation, we'll say that's 100 colonists. Your primary source will say 200. It's a free answer on your worksheet. So in the middle of the night, the colonists of Boston are going to dress up as Mohawk Native Americans, a tribe that we talked about as an ally for the British during the French and Indian War. And they dress up as a Mohawk because that's a Native American group that's around the territory. So they dress up as Mohawk Native Americans and they make their way onto the ships. And as they're on these 3 ships, they're given the order to dump all the tea into the harbor. Now this is 325 chests full of tea, a couple tons of tea inside of those crates. And they just dumped them inside the Boston Harbor. And what's interesting is that there was British ships in the area, but they didn't do anything to stop this from happening. And this is known as the Boston Tea Party. And overall, it was a waste of about $1 million of tea, not only for Great Britain, but for the East Indian Tea Company. So now the Parliament is going to have to respond. We can't allow these colonists to act like thugs or mobs that go around and vandalize British items. So we're going to have a brand new prime minister that takes over prior to the actual Boston Tea Party. We talked about William Pitt in regards to the French and Indian War. Then we talked about George Grenville on Monday. So Lord North is now in charge of the British government as the prime minister. And he is extremely angry at the colonists for how they are behaving. And he wants to punish Boston for the role and the resentment of this movement. So they decide that they're going to pass a series of laws. And the colonists are going to call these the Intolerable Acts. It really has 6 major parts to it. And for the rest of the slides, we're going to focus on these 6 parts of the Intolerable Acts. And really what this act does is kind of start to push the colonists away from trying to fix this relationship to consider to leave Great Britain. So the first act needs to address the idea of what happened on the Boston Harbor on December 16th. So Great Britain's Parliament is going to decide to pass an act that is going to close down the Boston Harbor. The only thing that is allowed to enter inside the Boston Harbor are goods sent by Great Britain for the military. And the goal is that we are going to keep the harbor closed until you're able to pay back that money that was lost. What this does is it kind of puts a limit on colonial trade and also outlaws them from actually being able to trade with foreign countries. So part 1 is the idea that the Boston Harbor is going to be closed until the colonists of Boston are able to pay off that deficit. The second act is that we are going to put Massachusetts as a whole underneath martial law. One of the first things we do is we really cancel the Massachusetts Constitution or the Massachusetts government. And we are going to elect or appoint in this situation by King George III, a guy named Thomas Gage, who was the military commander of all the troops inside of North America. By doing so, they're going to get rid of town meetings, which is where they discuss issues of the town. And they're also going to stop the free elections of colonial representation. So it's a total takeover of Massachusetts following the events in the Boston Harbor. Since we're taking over the government, we want to make sure we're taking over the court systems. So if a British officer is accused of committing some type of crime, they're not going to go through the process of being put on trial inside the colonies. They're actually going to send these British officials back over to Britain, and they're going to hold trial there. By doing so, the officers or individuals of of the British are going to kind of be let off with a lesser sentence because they believe that Great Britain is in the right here. So we're closing the harbor and we're turning Massachusetts into a total military state of martial law. The fifth and the second to last is the Quartering Act. And this is an amendment inside the Bill of Rights after the fight for independence. So the Quartering Act really allowed the British regulars or the redcoats or the military to take up quarters or to live in this situation within a colonist area. This was only supposed to be reserved for when the barracks are over capacity or if they're stationed way too far from where they need to be. Now, this does not mean that these soldiers are going to live within your private home, but if you were to have some type of farm or barn, they will be living within that area. It also required the colonists to pay for materials and food needed for the redcoats as they are on their stay. And then finally, the sixth act, which is sometimes associated with the Intolerable Acts, comes from the idea of the Quebec Act. And really what this allows colonies to do in Canada is to start to expand their borders down into the Ohio River Valley. This is kind of to get back at the colonists, which got done fighting a war to get that territory in which they're not able to occupy it. And it's also going to allow really freedom of religion for the French Canadian individuals that are still living in Canada after the war to kind of have that religious freedom, which is going to make a lot of the Protestants in the area very angry. What all this does, from the Sugar Act all the way down to the Intolerable Acts, is that it starts tearing the colonies in Great Britain apart. Sure, they're going to fight for their independence, but that's not the goal right away. The goal is to try to figure out a way to mend this relationship. So you're going to have some very important Americans want to sit and discuss a way to bring peace to the two sides. But a lot of individuals believe that has gone too far and that at this point in the relationship, there's no mending it. So a lot of these colonists or patriots are going to consider that it's time for a revolution and to break apart from Great Britain and try to fight for their independence. Once you have this slide, these are the notes for today. You're going to need a pencil because after everyone gets their notes and puts their notes away, you're going to be given a primary source with the worksheet. And it's going to highlight the Boston Tea Party. If you don't get it done in class, hold on to it, but please don't take a passage, and we can find time tomorrow to include that into our day. Hope you enjoyed this. A little awkward, but it is what it is.